panic attack is a sudden and spontaneous surge of intense anxiety or fear, and it's an experience that most people's brains will generate for them at least once in each person's lifetime. However, a highly unfortunate 2% of people will then go on to develop panic disorder, in which their brains start randomly generating even more panic attacks. This video is all about how panic attacks are generated in the brain and what causes the brain to develop full-blown panic disorder. When a neurotypical person experiences a panic attack, this typically occurs as a result of some external stressor or event, such as having to give a presentation at work or enduring some kind of life-threatening experience. Whereas in panic disorder, this severe anxiety attack tends to occur abruptly and with seemingly zero trigger. Either way, the sufferer typically experiences a bout of rapidly increasing anxiety, which becomes more severe and distressing with every moment. As this anxiety builds, it primarily manifests itself physically throughout the body, such as through sweating or trembling, or a racing heart, difficulty breathing, or even feelings of being choked. Many people report that in that moment, they feel as though they are going mad, having a heart attack, or that they are about to die. These terrible symptoms typically last from about 5 minutes to an hour, leaving the person drained and exhausted. However, what differentiates someone from simply experiencing an unpleasant panic attack to someone living with panic disorder is that the person with panic disorder goes on to persistently worry about experiencing yet another panic attack. So there is this cruel irony that the more that they fear it, the more likely they are to be subjected to another one, and the cycle repeats. In this way, panic disorder is generated by anxiety about anxiety, which is called anticipatory anxiety. People with panic disorder tend to have high anxiety sensitivity, meaning they are particularly fearful of the symptoms of anxiety and therefore catastrophize them, such as thinking heart palpitations mean they are experiencing a heart attack. Together, this creates a perverse feedback loop, plunging the person into even more panic. In 1989, a neuroscientist named Dr. Jack M. Gorman proposed a neuroanatomical model of panic disorder in a series of pioneering papers. This model continues to be a prominent theory of panic disorder today. Here, Gorman has argued that the fear and anxiety that is experienced within panic disorder are generated by a fear network within the brain. This theory is also known as the fear network model of panic disorder. Here, this network is shown to be overactive in people with panic disorder, as well as within other anxiety disorders. Specifically, Gorman broke panic disorder down into 3 critical psychological components. Firstly, into the acute panic attack, secondly, into anticipatory anxiety, which exists between panic attacks, and thirdly, into phobic avoidance, which is the avoidance of whatever is perceived to trigger the panic. Here, Gorman argues that each of these 3 psychological components which drive panic disorder are generated by 3 separate but interacting neurological systems in the brain. The first component, which is the acute panic attack itself, is argued to be primarily generated by brainstem regions, whilst anticipatory anxiety is thought to be mediated by limbic regions. And finally, phobic avoidance is argued to be orchestrated by the prefrontal cortex. And whilst the model does somewhat simplify these categorizations, this model is still the leading model of panic disorder today. So let's look at how this model explains panic disorder, starting with the panic attacks themselves. Most of the information from your senses, such as what you see or hear, enters the brain via an area called the thalamus, which sits at the top of your brainstem and is a kind of gateway to the cerebral cortex. As such, the thalamus serves as a kind of relay and distribution centre for sensory information, in which it dispenses that information to other regions of the brain based upon what the information is. If the sensory information is received by the thalamus and perceived to be potentially threatening, the thalamus not only sends the information to cortical areas for further processing, but it also activates the fear network. The leader of the fear network is the amygdala, and the amygdala promptly orchestrates the fear response by coordinating the activation of downstream brain regions outside of the cerebral cortex, which generate the physical symptoms of panic. Firstly, the amygdala activates the hypothalamus, which is the home of the sympathetic nervous system, which triggers the physiological symptoms of fight or flight, such as increased heart rate and sweating, alongside increased release of the stress hormone called cortisol. In addition to the hypothalamus, the amygdala also activates the periaqueductal gray, which assists the sympathetic nervous system in generating fight or flight behaviours. Furthermore, the amygdala also activates the locus ceruleus, which is the brain's primary source of norepinephrine, also known as the brain's adrenaline. As a result, your norepinephrine levels soar, which increases your heart rate. And lastly, the amygdala also activates the parabrachial nucleus, which controls your breathing and thereby can cause you to hyperventilate if it is knocked into overdrive. This is why the experience of panic can feel so deeply unpleasant, as your brain and body are responding as though an imminent and potentially violent threat is looming, preparing your body to cope with an impending attack. These same regions are also activated when non-human animals are frightened as well, such as rodents. This is because the brainstem is the evolutionarily oldest part of the brain across animals, and without it, life is not possible. But next we move on to the second part of Gorman's model, which is the limbic system's generation of anticipatory anxiety in between panic attacks, which acts as a positive feedback loop for the generation of further panic attacks. As for panic and fear, another network of brain regions activates in order to generate anticipatory anxiety. This mechanism is therefore called the anticipatory anxiety network. Overactivity in this network is responsible for generating anxiety between panic attacks in panic disorder. But overactivity in this network is also present in people who have anxious personalities in general, which is called high trait anxiety. Here, the anticipatory anxiety network includes the amygdala, as well as two other regions, which are called the anterior insular and the anterior cingulate cortex. Both the anterior insular and the anterior cingulate cortex are critical for processing internal bodily functions, which is called interoceptive processing. Examples of these processes include things like heart rate or breathing rate, which are called interoceptive sensations. Therefore, the anticipatory anxiety network monitors the bodily manifestations of panic attacks. Normally, in everyday situations, these interoceptive sensations are processed unconsciously. Let's use the example of heart rate. Throughout every moment of your life, your brain is constantly receiving information about how fast your heart is beating. But of course, most of the time, you are not consciously aware of your heart beating. Nonetheless though, your brain continues to process this information. When your heart rate suddenly changes speed though and starts racing, such as when you perceive a potential danger of some kind, your brain then detects this alteration and responds in a variety of potential ways. These options include either returning your heart rate to its normal rate or by modifying your heart rate in some way. Here it is the anterior insular, which is the region responsible for receiving the interoceptive information, including information about how fast your heart is beating. In addition to this, your brain is also constantly generating predictions about what your body is doing, including how fast your heart is beating, before it actually receives confirmation about what it's doing. And these interoceptive predictions are held within the anterior cingulate cortex. Here, the anterior cingulate cortex provides the anterior insular with its prediction about what the heart rate is, and the anterior insular receives the information about heart rate and compares it with the prediction. If the anterior cingulate is accurate in its prediction and there is no difference between expected versus actual heart rate, then you continue to be unaware of how fast your heart is beating. However, if a difference between them is detected, then the anterior insula generates something called a prediction error and increases its own activity whilst generating conscious awareness that your heart is racing, and therefore generates the feeling of anxiety. This is called interoceptive predictive coding, and this general process applies to your other interoceptive processes as well. Here, the brain attempts to handle this discrepancy by either sticking with its initial prediction of what heart rate should be, and thereby modifies heart rates that it normalizes to its original rate, or alternatively, it updates its prediction with the new information and continues to compare its prediction with further incoming information. When a neurotypical person isn't in danger, their brain typically responds to this unexpected rise in heart rate by sticking with the original prediction. In other words, it decides that the heart rate should be slower than it actually is, and the brain regions which control heart rate dutifully cause the heart rate to slow down. However, in someone with panic disorder, if their heart rate rises unexpectedly when they are in no danger, their brains do not dismiss the input telling them that their heart rate has risen. Instead, their brains update the prediction to account for the faster heart rate. The reason for this different reaction in people with panic disorder is because these people tend to catastrophize their symptoms, and because the brain often creates its own reality due to its control over the body. By believing that their panic symptoms are going to get even worse, this is exactly what happens. The brain rises to the expectation and causes your heart rate to accelerate even further to the point of generating a panic attack. This is in contrast to a neurotypical person who does not tend to catastrophize their symptoms. Consequently, the symptoms do not tend to worsen beyond a certain point, and the brain therefore brings their heart rate back to normal. In addition to all of this, people with panic disorder also tend to possess heightened interoceptive awareness. And so not only is their baseline level of anxiety higher than the average person's, but they are also typically better able to detect any discrepancy that occurs between their expected versus actual interoceptive processes. And lastly, when these discrepancies are detected, people with panic disorder are also more likely to pay attention to these discrepancies, which also worsens their symptoms. The prefrontal cortex sits at the front of your head and acts as the brain's control centre for cognition and reasoning. Here, your beliefs about yourself and your world are generated, and in panic disorder, as well as in anxiety disorders in general, these beliefs become twisted and warped by cognitive distortions, which are called interpretation biases. We already looked at how interpretation biases can disrupt bodily processing under the catastrophic misinterpretation model of interoception. However, these interpretation biases, or tendencies to perceive what is happening in a negative and catastrophic way, is not only directed toward interoceptive signals from internal organs, but also toward input from the external world, such as from your eyes and ears. This is because people with panic disorder also tend to hold negative and catastrophizing beliefs about their social environment and social interactions. Therefore, these negative beliefs also enter the predictive coding model and influence the encoding of their sensory information, distorting what they think they see and hear in a negative and hostile direction. This type of cognitive distortion is called the threat-oriented interpretation bias, and it causes them to look for indications of hostility or negativity. And when the brain fails to find such expressions, it therefore manipulates the encoding of this sensory information to match the cognitive bias. One well-known example of the power of predictive coding in neuroscience research lies in the perception of facial expression, because here, people with panic disorder, as well as anxiety disorders in general, tend to perceive neutral or ambiguous faces as expressing variant amounts of anger or hostility, in accordance with their threat-oriented interpretation bias. Here, people with panic disorder therefore operate in a hypervigilant state, which can lead to not only the avoidance of triggering situations, but also the avoidance of social environments altogether, as panic disorder shares high comorbidity with agoraphobia. In addition, this hypervigilant state can also promote the onset of panic attacks, as hypervigilance is generated by the anticipatory anxiety network. Therefore, through the altered functioning of the predictive coding model in processing interoceptive and sensory information, feelings of anxiety and episodes of panic are generated. Therefore, Gorman's model ultimately acts as a positive feedback loop, in which distorted beliefs modify interoceptive and sensory input, generating feelings of anxiety and panic. Altogether, panic disorder therefore exposes the almighty power of your brain, as well as its immense control over your perception of reality. Through the predictive coding model, your brain constructs your perception of your external reality, which it achieves by taking sensory signals and combining them with your existing beliefs and expectations. This is why optical illusions work, such as the Kinesa triangle, in which your brain perceives the image and concludes that it should see a central triangle, even though it doesn't exist, or influences whether you see a vase or two faces, which is based upon your thinking pattern. These illusory contours reveal that your brain fills in the gaps whenever it sees partial or incomplete information. This mechanism is also thought to underlie the hallucinations in psychosis, in which there is an over-reliance upon beliefs versus sensory input, which is thought to generate the delusions, as well as their resistance to contradictory information. Here, this system forms a devastating positive feedback loop, which is at the core of psychosis. But you can find out more about that in future videos.